The auditorium was alive with restless energy, buzzing with the chatter of hundreds of voices, the occasional laugh, and the faint shuffle of seats as people settled in. Bright spotlights swept across the stage, glinting off the judge's polished table and catching on the glimmering gold buzzer at its center. Cameras hovered on cranes, ready to capture every moment. For most of the crowd, this was just another audition in a long series. They had clapped politely for singers before, laughed at the jokes, gasped at a few surprising acts. But when the stagehand gave a small signal and a thin, nervous boy walked out onto the stage, the mood shifted, not with excitement, but with lowered expectations. He looked younger than most contestants who braved that enormous platform. His sneakers were scuffed, his jeans slightly too big, and the plain shirt he wore hung loosely over his small frame. He clutched the microphone as if it were his lifeline, fingers wrapped so tightly that his knuckles paled. The audience's chatter dulled to a low murmur, people whispering, assessing, already deciding what they thought of him. Even the judges exchanged small, doubtful glances. No one said it aloud, but the look in their eyes said it clearly: he doesn't seem ready. The boy swallowed hard. From where he stood, the stage lights seemed blinding, washing over his face in white and gold. He could see almost nothing of the crowd beyond the first few rows, but he could feel them, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on him, waiting, judging. His heart hammered in his chest, so loud he thought it might drown out his own thoughts. For a moment, he considered stepping back, retreating behind the curtain where it was safe, where no one could see him fail. But then he remembered why he had come. In his pocket was a small, folded piece of paper, a note from his late father. He had read it so many times the words were practically engraved into his memory: sing with your heart. Don't be afraid to let them hear who you are. It was those words that had pushed him here, across all the doubts, across all the fear. Now, standing under the bright lights, he knew he had one chance to prove that his father's faith hadn't been misplaced. He raised the microphone slowly to his lips, his hands trembling just slightly. The first seconds stretched endlessly, the silence in the auditorium deepening until it felt almost unbearable. Somewhere in the front row, a man cleared his throat. A woman adjusted her scarf. The judges leaned back in their chairs, waiting to see whether this boy would stumble or surprise them. The boy drew in a shaky breath. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, shutting out the glare of the lights, shutting out the murmurs, shutting out everything but the memory of his father's voice telling him to be brave. When he opened his eyes again, there was a new steadiness there, a fragile but undeniable spark of determination. He nodded once to the sound technician. The opening chords of Hotel California filled the hall, the familiar strum of the guitar echoing softly at first. A ripple of recognition ran through the audience. Some people straightened, others smiled faintly, intrigued despite themselves. It was a song so iconic, so beloved, that anyone attempting it risked immediate comparison to the original. For a boy like him, it seemed almost too big. And yet, as he gripped the microphone tighter, the corners of his mouth twitching nervously, there was a quiet conviction in the way he squared his shoulders. He leaned in slightly, letting the first note form in the back of his throat. His voice wavered for a split second, fragile, as though it might crack under the pressure. But then it smoothed, carrying into the vast auditorium with surprising clarity. The judges, who had been leaning lazily in their chairs, suddenly straightened. Their expressions shifted from polite indifference to surprise, their eyes narrowing as they listened closer. The audience fell into an uneasy hush, as though caught between disbelief and curiosity. Something in his voice tugged at them, even in those opening lines. It wasn't perfect, not polished like a professional recording, but it was raw, filled with an emotion that cut through the surface and spoke directly to something deeper. The boy sang as if he were telling a story only he knew, every word weighted with meaning. He didn't perform to impress or dazzle, he performed to be heard, to share a piece of himself that had remained hidden until this very moment. Each syllable carried the ache of his past, the longing of his heart, and the quiet strength he had built out of hardship. By the time he finished the first verse, the auditorium was utterly still. The whispers had died, the restless shifting had ceased. The boy, who moments ago had looked so small and unsure, now stood taller, steadier, his voice filling the space like a tide rising against the shore. And though he hadn't reached the chorus yet, everyone in that hall, judges, audience, even the skeptical crew backstage, could sense it, something extraordinary was unfolding right before their eyes. The boy's voice began to rise, steadier now, each note growing with a confidence that seemed to build from somewhere deep within him. The first verse had silenced the audience, but as the song carried forward, the shift was undeniable. What had started as a nervous attempt was turning into something magnetic, something that pulled at everyone present. His voice wasn't just hitting the right notes, it was telling the story, weaving the melancholy beauty of Hotel California into something raw and personal. The judges leaned in almost simultaneously, their earlier skepticism dissolving into awe. One judge, a woman with a reputation for brutal honesty, rested her chin on her hand, her eyes widening as if she couldn't believe the sound coming from someone so unassuming. Another judge tapped his finger against the table in time with the rhythm, his expression softening as the boy's voice soared higher. The third judge glanced at his fellow panelists, raising his brows in disbelief, as though silently asking, "Are you hearing this too?" The audience, once restless and distracted, was now entranced. Some leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the stage. Others pulled out their phones, no longer for amusement but to capture what was quickly becoming an unforgettable performance. The glow of dozens of tiny screens dotted the darkened auditorium, their lights bobbing gently like stars against the sea of shadows. A few people in the crowd lifted their hands and swayed slowly, letting the music wash over them. The boy closed his eyes briefly as he reached the chorus, his voice expanding, fuller and richer than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about technical skill, though his pitch was nearly flawless, it was about the weight of the emotion behind every word. He sang as though the lyrics had been etched onto his heart, each line carrying years of longing, struggle, and hope. He wasn't imitating the Eagles, he was reimagining their masterpiece through the filter of his own life. On the judges' table, subtle changes revealed just how much he was affecting them. The woman who had been skeptical now had tears welling in her eyes, blinking rapidly as if to fight them back. The male judge with his finger tapping had stopped, his hand pressed flat to the table, his expression soft with something like pride. The third judge whispered something under his breath, shaking his head slowly, disbelief etched into his face. By the second chorus, the audience had fully surrendered to the performance. The arena vibrated with a shared hush, a kind of reverent stillness that only came when art transcended entertainment. The boy's voice climbed effortlessly into the higher notes, carrying the weight of emotion that made it feel less like a performance and more like a confession. His body was no longer trembling. He stood firm, grounded, the microphone steady in his grip as though he had discovered his own power in real time. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing the intensity in his expression, the way his brow furrowed with focus, the way his lips shaped each word with precision and feeling. At home, viewers would later replay those close-ups, marveling at how someone so ordinary in appearance could produce something so extraordinary. Gasps rippled across the audience as he held a particularly difficult note longer than expected, his voice unwavering, filling every corner of the auditorium. Someone shouted, "Yes," from the back rows, breaking the silence for a moment before applause began to spread. It started small, scattered claps and cheers, but quickly grew until the entire hall thundered with support, people rising to their feet before the song was even finished. And through it all, the boy remained focused, channeling everything he had into the song. He wasn't distracted by the applause, nor the glow of phones recording him. He was somewhere else entirely, lost in the music, his eyes shining with something unspoken, pain, love, longing, maybe all three. Each note seemed to free him, to lift something heavy from his shoulders, and he gave it willingly to the audience who were now hanging on every sound. As the song built toward its final crescendo, the judges exchanged glances, their unspoken agreement clear. This wasn't just another good performance. This was special, rare, unforgettable. The golden buzzer, which had sat untouched at the center of their table all night, was no longer just a decoration. It was destiny waiting to be fulfilled. When the boy opened his eyes on the last verse and looked out at the sea of faces, there was no fear in him anymore. There was only strength, only the quiet triumph of someone who had finally been seen, finally been heard. His voice soared one last time, and the hall seemed to vibrate with its power. By the time the final notes faded, leaving a resonant echo hanging in the air, the judges' hands hovered close to that golden button. The crowd had risen fully to their feet, cheers rolling like thunder, some people wiping tears from their eyes. Even before the confetti fell, it was clear. The boy had given them something more than music, he had given them his soul. The final note hung in the air like a prayer, stretching across the auditorium in a silence so pure it felt sacred. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The boy stood frozen at center stage, chest heaving, his hands gripping the microphone as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. His eyes searched the sea of faces before him, but all he could see was a blur of light and shadow. The quiet was deafening, and for a split second, fear pricked his heart. Had he failed? And then it came. A roar erupted, wave-like and unstoppable, as the audience surged to its feet. Applause thundered through the hall, echoing off the walls like rolling storms. People screamed his name, shouted words of encouragement, waved their arms in the air. Phones flashed as they recorded, hundreds of tiny lights capturing the moment for eternity. Some audience members were crying openly, their tears streaming down faces lit by the glow of the stage. The boy blinked, overwhelmed, his throat tight with emotion. He hadn't expected this. He had dreamed of it, maybe, in the quiet of his room late at night, but reality was so much bigger, so much louder, so much brighter than anything he had dared to imagine. His knees wobbled slightly, and he clutched the microphone tighter just to steady himself. At the judges' table, the reaction was no less explosive. One judge clapped furiously, her hands red from the force of her applause. The strictest judge, known for his cutting remarks, was on his feet, shaking his head in disbelief, a rare smile breaking across his face. But it was the third judge, the woman who had been holding back tears earlier, who suddenly pushed her chair back, her hand trembling as she reached forward. The golden buzzer gleamed beneath her palm for the briefest of seconds before she slammed it down. The sound rang out like a gunshot, sharp and final. The stage lights shifted instantly, golden beams flooding the boy in a halo of brilliance. From above, streams of golden confetti exploded into the air, tumbling down in shimmering cascades. The audience screamed louder, their voices blending into a joyous roar that shook the floor beneath their feet. The boy staggered back a step, his free hand flying to his mouth. Tears welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks as he stared upward at the glittering rain falling over him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his small frame almost collapsing under the weight of emotion. He had done it. Against every doubt, every fear, every whispered criticism, he had turned this moment into something unforgettable. The judges stood as one, clapping, cheering, gesturing for him to soak it all in. The woman who had pressed the button leaned into her microphone, her voice breaking as she spoke over the roar. That was not just a performance, she said, her words trembling with sincerity. That was magic. You are a star. The boy shook his head, still stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. His tears streamed freely now, illuminated by the stage lights, turning his face into a portrait of raw humanity. He raised the microphone with shaking hands, trying to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. All he could manage was a breathless, "Thank you." The audience answered with another wave of cheers, chanting his name, clapping in rhythm, stamping their feet. The sound was so loud it felt like the walls themselves might crack. Confetti clung to his hair, sparkled against his shirt, fluttered around his shoulders like blessings falling from the heavens. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the golden rain cover him, letting the sound of thousands of people embrace him. In that instant, he wasn't the poor boy with worn shoes and quiet dreams. He was something more. He was someone who had touched hearts, someone whose voice had carried across barriers, someone who belonged. Backstage, crew members watched with tears in their eyes, whispering to each other that this was one of those rare, once-in-a-lifetime moments. The kind of audition that would be replayed millions of times, that would inspire countless others to be brave, to step forward, to sing even when the world doubted them. On stage, the boy finally lowered his microphone, his hands trembling less now, his face breaking into a radiant, tear-streaked smile. He looked out over the crowd again, but this time he didn't see shadows. He saw people, hundreds of them, all standing for him. All believing in him. The golden confetti kept falling, swirling like stardust in the beams of light, each piece a fragment of a dream come true. And as the judges applauded, the audience roared, and the boy stood at the center of it all. One truth became clear: this was not the end of his story. This was only the beginning.